Thanks, Catherine, and hi, everybody. It's so nice to be with you today. Happy Friday in the middle of Maytember, as one of my fellow parent friends called it. It's a chaotic time, but I'm glad to carve this out together to take a look at this. I'm going to share my screen and we'll walk through slides. And there we go. Really focused on these survey results. And then I hope that I'll go through the results as we have them and talk about what I see in them, right? And then I'm hoping we can have a more open conversation about what now, right? Both at the individual school level, but as a collective, what are some of the opportunity areas for us? So this survey was done at the end of last calendar year after your gathering. Um, and I said, we're going to talk about the survey results first, then we'll talk about next steps potentially at a school level, and then we really want to think about those collective next steps. The survey we had 51 responses, 46 different schools participated. So some of you had two colleagues at your school participate. It was a really qualitative survey, right? So it mostly asked narrative questions. What kinds of things are you doing to serve this student population, right? And defining this student population is part of the puzzle, and I'll get to that in a minute. The types of schools that responded, we had 22 traditional Jesuit high schools, 12 Jesuit nativity schools, 4 Cristo Rey schools, and so on. And this is really important, right? Because we know, for example, nativity and Cristo Rey schools have a very specific student population that is based on financial requirements for the families. And so thinking about how that mission gets integrated with sort of our understanding of this challenge as a whole and where this fits into all of our missions. So because the results are qualitative, I'll show you examples from all of these different types of schools, and it's something for us just to bear in mind. One of the first questions in the survey was just sort of sizing up. Who do you serve now? And in this sort of loose term, as we have it at this point, it was sort of this right to education group, right? We have a sense at the moment, and when we did the survey, that this is about economics, right? This is about students who otherwise wouldn't have access to the highest quality educational options because of their community or family income. So this question was hard for folks, but the results of it were that 100% of schools offer something, right? Either need-based financial aid or some equivalent, either a tuition-free model or access to school choice funds that are need-dependent. Of course, the Cristo Rey Network schools exclusively serve a population that falls below a shared income threshold. Nativity schools are tuition-free, and at all the other schools, we asked respondents to say, if you had to ballpark a percentage, right, of your students that would fall in this category, what would it look like? And the responses had a huge range from 5 to 100%. And so this is all just to acknowledge that we're coming from very different places. And the challenge is to figure out what are those shared things that we can learn from each other? How do we set goals that are both unique to my campus, but also learning from other schools that might have a really different circumstance? This question was really hard, however. I got a lot of responses that said, I don't know how to size this, I don't know where I get this data from. And so if that is you, right, or if that resonates, there are near-term options, right? Thinking about what are those definitions that narrow in on the target population that aligns with your school's goals and circumstances. Some schools responded relative to free and reduced lunch rates. Some schools talked about first-generation college students. Some schools talk about, at least 80% of their tuition is covered because of need-based aid. Settling on a definition, right, is a first step to being able to track this a little bit more rigorously, and then having mechanisms to sort of get a baseline and say, okay, where are we now in terms of scope? When we talk about students that fit under this right to education umbrella, do we, at least at our school, have a sense of what that looks like? And then being able to track data against it in a way that is systematic. But this was a good question just to gauge our understanding. How well do we have a sense of who's on our campus and how we have lived out this part of our mission so far? The next part of the survey got into programming. So we divided it into two sections. The first was about creating access. So these questions asked respondents to identify what are you doing at your school, processes, activities, programs, etc., that have the greatest impact on creating access for students from those under-resourced communities. And so this is about accessing educational opportunities. And so every respondent had 3 or 4 openings to list programs. So some people listed more than one. But mostly when we look at access, you see there's an extreme on the far left that most schools are thinking about financial access. So that looks like tuition, and it looks like other programs that make it financially easier for families to access programs. And then when you categorize all the other responses, there's a huge diversity of ways that schools are thinking about creating access. And I'll pause to say that the way I generated these categories was reading the responses and putting them into buckets of my own. So this isn't scientific, it's not perfect. But the idea was, can we gather sort of a rough sense of what's the type of work that you all are doing when we talk about creating access? So after financial, there's recruitment. So recruiting specifically to the student population, academic support, comprehensive support, summer programming, and so on. And you can see all the different ways in which access programs are created. On the next slides, and we will make these slides accessible to you all. There's a lot of text on them, which I'm not going to go through. But I have a few slides that sort of zoom in on some of these issues, right? So there's a huge breadth of ways that schools are thinking about creating access. And when we look at that first category, that first bar in the bar graph, financial support, most schools, 2/3 of the schools, mention financial support as one of the ways that they think about creating access for students who fall under this umbrella relative to economic circumstance. And that looked like tuition assistance, support for non-tuition expenses, and then support with school choice programming. And on the right, there's some of the specific programs, but this is a really common way that schools are trying to create access for students of financial need. And wouldn't be a surprise, right? It makes sense that this is the first one on our list. That second category around recruitment practices, about a quarter of the schools responded that one of the ways they focus on creating access for students under the Right to Education umbrella is around recruitment strategies. So targeted marketing, having really strategic relationships with feeder schools or community organizations, early identification programs, admission criteria. Again, there's a few sample programs over on the right, but the sort of essence here is that the schools in this category were saying we create access by seeking those students out, not assuming that those students are going to come find us. And so that sort of, there are enough schools practicing that strategy, right, that it came to the top as something really important. The third bucket was around academic supports. And so 20% of the schools that responded talked about academic support as a way that they create access. So they talked about academic interventions around executive function, academic support, and even just the overall instructional style. I have the text in yellow here on the right, just so I would remember which ones I wanted to highlight. So thinking about how to make this feel concrete, we had one school, Christopher Ray in Milwaukee, talked about their way of training teachers. They hold a very specific student population at the school, and they work on pedagogy, and their approach to teaching is really tailored to their student population. And they talk about that as an access issue, right? Another school, a Jesuit high school in Sacramento, has an academic support center, right? And that's also an access strategy for them, making sure students are able to access the educational opportunities at the school. There were many others, but that's a way to sort of crystallize in our minds when we think about what are the ways our network is putting into practice our goal of creating access. These are some of the strategies, right? Another was comprehensive support programs. Again, about 20% of schools listed this. Several schools have an allocated staff member or department support at specific times in that high school transition. So the example here is St. Xavier in Cincinnati providing wraparound services to help remove barriers to access, and they have a department allocated to this. The mission of that department is to provide access to all of the resources the school has to offer. And there were several schools that talked about something in this neighborhood of comprehensive support. Family support was another. 16% of schools talked about family support, dual language support, right? Access looks like making sure that families can have access to the school in their preferred language, right? Whether through the recruitment process or the admissions process and so on, that they know this is a place where they can connect with the school in their preferred language. There's also schools offering wraparound services for families or a family liaison specific to a demographic group that the school is working with. Um, and summer programming was another one of the really common ways that schools listed as an impactful program around access. We say that making that softer transition, bringing students in early, summer leadership programs, summer bridge programs, how can we create access to our school by sort of paving that way with summer programming? And that was another one of the big categories that came out. So before we move on, I'll just sort of recap when there were hundreds of responses, right? 51 respondents listed anywhere between 2 and 4 programs that they said these are really important parts of creating access. I highlighted a few and I tried to highlight trends because that's way too much for us to look at collectively. The idea here is to think about what are the big things that we're learning. There are some common practices and some hopefully intriguing practices, right? And so those were when we asked sort of what helps, what do you think is really making a difference in terms of creating access? Those were sort of the big issues, and there are plenty more. The second big category we asked about was creating a sense of belonging. So, okay, we've got them in the door. And now, what are the programs that you all have in place that you think have the biggest impact on creating a sense of belonging for students who are coming from under-resourced communities into your school? Again, I read all of the responses and bucketed them as best I could. There's definitely subjectivity here, and your programs are really complex. That said, a lot of schools listed cultural clubs or affinity groups as one of the ways that they create a sense of belonging. DEIB programming was called out, school identity and school spirit, retreat programs, house systems, family engagement. It goes on. There's a lot of ideas in this space about how do we make our school one where students can find their place and find a sense of belonging, and particularly these students who are coming in from the economic position that might be different from their peers if you're at a traditional school or otherwise sort of fall under the category that we're trying to impact through these right to education initiatives. So if we again zoom in on a few of these top ones, we're not going through all of them, but we say, okay, let's unpack the first ones, cultural clubs and affinity groups. So about a third of schools talked about identity clubs, affinity groups as one of the ways that they create belonging. The numbers won't match up in case that's driving you crazy between the slides because some schools listed multiple, right? But the idea here is that this is a pretty robust area. A lot of schools are saying affinity groups are one of the tools in our toolkit when it comes to creating a sense of belonging for students that we want to serve here. So one example here, Jesuit High School in Portland has 17 affinity groups who work on fostering a sense of belonging for their community, and those club leaders join together as a diversity and inclusion student council. Right? And you have variations on that. That's one example of what we heard across schools as how this sort of comes into practice. Second category is DEIB programming. Schools, just shy of 20% of schools cited some sort of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging programming deliberately developed and that they feel is effective in creating a sense of belonging for these students. So Brooklyn Jesuit Prep talked about their diverse school community shares about cultures deliberately during spirit weeks and assemblies and have a real focus on a cultural appreciation and faith and learning about others. And so that type of programming they feel is effective towards creating that sense of belonging. The next big category, if we're thinking down that bar chart of what are the other types of programs that create belonging, was around school identity and school spirit. And the idea here, as I understand it, right, is belonging to a greater whole and having the traditions to ground that, support people feeling like they belong as part of that whole. St. Ignatius Loyola Academy in Baltimore talked about their tie ceremony, awards ceremonies, graduation, have sort of established such a groundwork for their community that people belong, that cultivates that sense of belonging. So in this place, right, it's not a targeted program to say we're seeking out those students who would fall under a right to education type initiative, but we as a school have such a commitment to traditions and school identity and school spirit that it fosters that sense of belonging, and cultivating that makes this a place where more people can find their sense of belonging at our school. So that's one example. Retreats are another one, and similarly, very often around this is something that we do as a school that is not typically targeted for students, right? We're not having retreats necessarily just for students who come from a specific subpopulation, but instead our retreat program in general makes this a place where people can find a sense of belonging. It fosters that sense of belonging. So these aren't targeted programs necessarily, but we asked you to list impactful programs. So on the retreat side of things, schools talked about their all class retreats, their travel programs, their different options for this whole same idea that when the school comes together, grounded in faith and grounded in service programs or sort of whole school identity, that they're able to cultivate a place where students find a sense of belonging. Many schools, not many, 7 out of the 51 schools talked about advisory, house, fellowship, everyone calling it something a little bit differently. But again, those structures that create a whole school sense of belonging and then facilitate that sense of belonging for students who are coming from other student population that might be less represented at the school. So those are the two big categories in terms of programs, right? We asked about access and we asked about belonging. We said, give us a sense of what you think you already do well. Then we talked about what's that transition into high school look like? What are the programs that you've implemented that have helped make that easier when we're talking about students who are coming from under-resourced communities, coming from economic situations where they might not have a lot of other educational options? One of the questions we asked here is, how's that going in general? Are you happy with it? Right? And so 20 of the schools said, we're pretty happy with where we are in terms of that high school piece, that transition into high school. We feel solid about our programming. And 25 schools said we want to do more, right? And some of them, 17, said we have programs already identified, and some said we want to do more, but we really need ideas. And this tells me there's interest out there, right, in talking about this collectively, that transition into high school is a place where, whether we have ideas or not, a lot of schools want to be doing more in this space. And so it's an opportunity area to think about. This was both from middle schools and high schools. So middle schools offered their effective programs, a high school bridge program, high school scholars program, et cetera. And then the high schools talked about what they do. We have a summer bridge program, the Fisher program, a graduate support director. So the support's coming from both sides. This question was really to say this issue of transition into high school, how much are we focused on it now and how much would we like to be focused on it? We also asked about the transition into college. So the same question, looking at that transition into college, what are those programs that your schools implemented that have supported positive experiences for students from these under-resourced communities? This is a place where there's even more interest, right, in getting a little bit more work underway. 13 of the responding schools said they're satisfied. We feel good about what we're doing. 19 said we'd like to be doing more and we might have some ideas in that space. And another 13 said we want to do more but need ideas. So when we talk at the end again about where is there collective opportunity to learn together, to brainstorm together, this is an area where there's, again, obvious interest in thinking more about how do we support that college transition for students who are coming in, excuse me, from economic circumstances which are otherwise educationally limiting. We asked for sample programs, right? And there are a lot of ideas: alumni support specialists, organizational partnerships, engaging your alums. So schools are doing active work in this space and there's interest in doing more. So then that's the end of the survey results. And I talked a lot about the survey results. I'm going to open up for sort of questions and dialogue. But first, I wanted to just sort of give some initial thoughts on how you can think about responding individually. I know for some schools, I know because you wrote it in the comments, for some schools, this was a really hard survey. And, everybody's coming in, as we looked at in the beginning, at from a very different circumstance, right? Ranging from 5% of our students sort of coming in with some economic need to all of our students. This is such a part of our mission. And so this is a part of everybody's efforts, right? This is a part of the shared mission of being Catholic schools, of being Jesuit schools. And so when we think about what does it look like to move forward as an individual school, often the work can be shaped by thinking more systematically, right? And so I talked up front about adopting definitions and goals. That's some really important work to say, if that's not clear yet, how do we define our goals in this space? Do we want more of these students, or do we want to go deeper with the students that we have, right? And getting clear about how do we want to measure that? There's assessment work, thinking about how many students are we serving now? How many would we like to serve? And how good is it going, right? Do we have a sense of the quality of our support now? And then identifying actionable steps. It might be improved measurement is the actionable step, or it could be picking up some of the strategies on these slides that we talked about today. This sparked a new idea, and so we're going to pick off of an initiative. And then it's just that ongoing evaluation cycle. We implement with monitoring in mind. Are we making sure that we're thinking about scope and quality? And then hopefully sharing findings, because the collaborative effort is so important. Excuse me. So I'm gonna stop sharing because I want to open up conversation. First, I would love to take any questions you have about the survey results. Um, and then as a sort of second, and I think these conversations fuse together, what initial ideas does it bring up? When we think about where we'd like to move collectively, where do we see the biggest opportunity areas? What thoughts have arisen for you as we look at the data together? So please feel free to chime in either in the chat or just speak up. We're not such a large group that it's impractical.
You all know I'm really bad with those silences, so I have to jump in. I want to make a mention that this work we see as integral to every part of our schools and the work that all of you do. So kind of through that framing, there are people on that are in different roles in our schools, and I'd be really curious, kind of from where you sit in the school, what is or outside the school for those who are coming in from outside, like what do you how are you responding to this? Megan, I see. Thank you, Tom, for putting some in the chat. Thomas, do you want to share a little what you put in the chat?
Well, yeah, thanks, Catherine. Basically what I said was we have a new director of culture and belonging, and she's giving her first day of the school presentation in just an hour and a half. I just think that this would be really good stuff to be able to share with her as we're sort of evaluating going forward how we reach out, support underserved communities in our school. I'm also, I guess, somewhat disappointed by the fact that I don't see my school's name anywhere on here. I don't think that was me who dropped the ball on that, but I'm going to look a little further into it. But Megan, I think this is really, really good information. I'm very, it does excite me to think about ways that we can continue to improve, and especially in recruitment and retention, and then support even after high school. I think this is a good step for us as a school and for the JSN in general.
Yeah, I will say, if you don't see your name, you may still have filled it out. I grabbed samples, right, from every category, because the actual data, as you can imagine, from 50-something respondents with 10 narrative questions, and everybody wrote really prolifically, is a lot. And so hopefully this is a sampler platter of what's out there to kind of get us thinking categorically. Not exclusive of all the ideas out there, for sure.
And what Creighton Prep, you actually have a really impressive programming and income-based tuition that is pretty spectacular, I think, the way it's working from what I understood.
Yeah, between our in which I guess they tell us we've always done but never publicized. And now the last couple of years we have made it much more accessible to, I think, interested families. But we also have our Loyola Scholars Program, and that's dealing mostly with junior, 5th through 8th grade students in underserved populations. And if they attend that for 4 years, they get tuition at Creighton Prep. And so there have been really, really good strides, but there's
Yeah.
still so much left to do.
How many students?
Always, right?
How many students, Thomas, in the Loyola Scholars?
Oh, I would say between probably graduating is probably close to 10 to 15. I think the program tends to have 20 to 30 starting out, and then we usually lose a few over the course of those 4 years.
Per year.
Uh-huh. Yep.
So it's conceivable to think that there are 60 students.
Yeah, that would be a guess on my part, but I've been to several
Yeah.
of their dinners and kind of followed the cohort, and that seems, I think, about right.
Yeah. So when I think of like Rockhurst or Gonzaga, Creighton, in addition to the things we've been talking about for life in the school, there are actually programs and structures that you offer. So thank you for that. Yeah.
You bet.
And that is data that I think
Yeah.
is next for us to gather of within the program you have in schools, what numbers, and Danny Villanueva, who's on, will know that we need that data.
But certainly that was a question that came up, Megan, as I was listening, that our approach for this survey was everybody, and I'm wondering, do you see, Megan, anything in the surveys that would help us in the next step of maybe addressing things by program and by model? So for example, with the secondary schools that are traditional secondary schools, do you see any data that would indicate it would be worthwhile gathering programs like the Hurtados at Rockhurst, the Loyolas at Creighton, or the Vincos at Gonzaga in a separate way than Nativity, Cristo Rey, and such, just because we kind of just did it like everybody in, and there just seems to be a lot of diversity out there.
There's a lot of diversity out there. I will say even among traditional high schools, there is a huge amount of diversity in how you're approaching this student population. And so I think in terms of collecting information about programs that are effective, there's probably a next stage that's just a little bit more disciplined and detailed, right? To say, we used this to get a sense of what like the options on a multiple choice survey might be, but now we honing in and say, okay, for those that are at a traditional high school offering tuition assistance programs, right? What are the different ways you've done that? How has it been funded, right? And kind of doing some of that next level detail so that that becomes a little bit more actionable and useful. I think this gives us a sense of the universe of what's out there. And it's going to be hard to make a tool that is going to be right for everybody. You're going to narrow it down to the point when you can only ask one school one question. But getting more specificity, if there's so much work being done around trying to think of one of the categories, not just the financial side, although that's really significant, but recruitment practices, for example, that's a great place to hone in and get more specificity, right? Who's hired somebody specifically as sort of a liaison to a school community, who has a specific approach to partnerships, and we can get some of the particulars of those programs so that it becomes a little bit more useful. We have some of that, but this was a cast a wide net kind of an effort. I do think that as this work goes on collectively, right, there will be a real difference in how Nativity and Cristo Rey schools are approaching their work than how tuition-driven schools are approaching the work, right? The overall mission might be the same, but the way of operating is going to be really different. And there are times when there's joint learning, in both directions, and times when that strategy is going to be divergent.
And those are the programs and models, but then there's also the sort of culture development of issues of belonging that we looked at in Detroit, belonging, um, transitions, and affordances, and just sort of the cultural aspects of it are. So you figure there are probably two lungs. One is what are just programs, what are school models, how do we share best practices, how do we develop those, and then there's sort of the cultural supports that lead to success. And that's kind of how we laid out Detroit. And I'm hearing the survey brought those delineations as well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that as you think about where do we go together, right? There is universal interest, regardless of your school model, in that high school, that middle school to high school transition, or that high school to college transition. Students coming from places of economic need are going to need some special thinking, right, around how do we support that college transition. And that might be a place where there's a lot of joint efforts, where recruitment practices might be a place where it really depends on what kind of school you're in, and a little bit more on the local circumstance. So there can be some sort of honing about how do we work together and identifying some of the next steps. I do think that another potential sort of outcome, if some sort of committee or working group comes out of this, is being able to offer some shared definitions to schools for better tracking and reporting. Because if we want to set goals around this work, uh, the definition could change by campus, right, and be adapted, but you should have a definition. You should be able to say, we want to grow the amount of students we're working with this on by this much, or we want to sort of be able to go deep with 5% of our student body and know that we've really served them in this way. But it's hard to get specific about this because it's a very difficult kind of definition to land on. And I think that that's a place where there can also be a lot of support in the group thinking.
I think that we've looked a lot at models, we've looked at culture. I think another place to look is just age groups. What we found at Rockhurst is that if we get the kids in the middle school years and we get them for the 3 years, they're really prepped well for high school. What we found though is that we could get some students who don't go through our Hurtado program, who then are coming from some of these same backgrounds and same neighborhoods and same schools, and they're coming as freshmen, and we really have no idea how to support them. That's something that we're trying to make up as we go. And I think about Loyola Academy in St. Louis just extended their programming into lower elementary, because we realized the earlier we can start to work with the students and the families, the more time we have to support them and form them and help them have their best chance of success. But what about those students that we don't get to high school? And so I think that would be an interesting thing for us as a group to look at, is like entry points. If we can get them in early elementary versus middle school versus high school, regardless of what the model is.
Yeah, what does access and belonging look like at ninth grade, and why would that be different from a different standpoint?
I think that's one of the spaces where the three nested schools and perhaps other ones can help, because I know for us here at the Walsh Academy here at Cleveland at St. Ignatius High School, when our first guys moved from the 8th grade to the 9th grade, there was this question about, well, Marianne, how do we help transition your guys into the high school? And my response was, well, how do we help transition every 9th grader into the high school? Right. So I think some of this is about context setting again for all of us, and based on our own individual mission statements at each school and based on the UAPs. But I do think the work in rights education, when we have these conversations, we're not even just helping boys and girls of modest economic means at the school. We're actually helping the entire student body if we open ourselves up a little bit more to this, that we are, we continue to loop back to the original missions of our Jesuit schools, just in a new time and a new societal framework, let's say. So they're just good reminders, right, of going back of what does good pedagogy look like, what does good education look like, and why do we do this? And then And because we can all get set in our ways of like, well, we've been doing this for many years, so this is what it works. Well, does it really work? And did it really work back then? So it gives us some time to open up to what we know and better understand.
I really appreciate what you said, Marianne, about the fact that we want at some point not to have to offer support in some sense. So it might be useful to think about what the objectives are to the different programs that we have and what the impact is. I know for Reach, we have feeder schools. Our students go into Regis, Xavier, Fordham Prep. They have excellent college counseling programs. So the big reason we don't have a lot of follow-up with students from the Reach program that go to college is because they integrate into these communities and then they go to university like any other high school student at Fordham Prep, at Xavier, at Regis. So going back to what Bob said, I think we have to think about affordances, and we have to think about affordances are ways to get to a goal. And then we have to think about if we want the objective to go beyond a certain point, or if really the objective of all of these programs is to create a community.
And Rodrigo, you wanted to say a little bit. So Rodrigo's at Regis High School and in Reach, which is a pre-high school, pre-secondary school program. So on the call, we have high school programs. I'm sorry, secondary programs. We have pre-secondary programs. We also have secondary models and pre-secondary models. So, we're trying to define our terms, but the Reach program is a pre-secondary program, whereas Marianne is in a pre-secondary model. So just to, we're working through all.
Sure. I'll work on my lingo. That's a lot going.
Oh yeah, Catherine and I have been, we're sometimes too much inside the bubble, but it's just been helpful thinking that out a little bit. So thanks.
I'm Jenny Ehalt from BC High. I just want to say this reminds me a lot of the breadth of the Global Dimensions inventory, like how much you're asking of folks. And even just listening to some of those things, I'm like, I would need to ask finance, and I need to ask enrollment, and what is our DEI office doing? So whenever the next iteration comes around, if I find out when it comes around, I would say like I would want to pull a committee together. This is great work to do together so that you're informing each other, but also really getting an accurate picture, because when we do the GDI, it takes a couple weeks for us to get everyone into a room or to go back and forth with folks. So it just felt similar to me. And even the examples you pulled out, they're so helpful. And when I think about the report, Megan, that you have made for all of our schools, they're so well done that I can go in and say, oh, this school has something really innovative. I know who to reach out to about X, Y, or Z. So I just saw the similarities there.
Thanks, Jenny. I think with the global dimensions inventory, right, we were at the next phase, where we could really say clearly, do you have type program A, B, C, or D, right, and get specific. And this is the preliminary to say what is out there, right, and does that inform our ability to kind of catalog efforts a little bit? As I said, the categories are my own, and that was based on my best read of things. But I think there's so much good work out there. And now the challenge is, where do we all need support? How do you make this useful, right, in the collective and both individually?
And Megan, I think I was going where you landed, which was understanding what people would want to do beyond what they're doing right now, right? Is a big part of it. It's like, hey, this is working, this is great. And there's the combination of best practices that, I would weave that into my program. And I think that would, address some of the shortcomings we've had, either in terms of access or inclusiveness, or the outputs, right? Or the outcomes, which is, oh, great. If I have that program, I'm more likely to see these students be successful as they move through, as an example. So that wish list conversation, I think, would be really interesting to have in the context of what Jennifer alluded to.
And certainly Catherine and I will be talking about this, but it'd be interesting to consider what the next step is, not what the sixth step is out there. And Megan, your some defining terms. So it sounds like what we're saying is just we'll continue in our categorization or our language just to get a little bit more refined going along the way. So that's what I was wondering about, is what is the next step rather than the sixth step? Just asking the group that question. So if you were to give us a charge, what does that next step look like?
For me, or is this for the group?
Well, everybody, the
Yeah.
group.
I think
What do you think,
Yes.
Kathleen?
I'm listening, and I love Jenny. Thank you. So Jenny Ehalt from BC has been part of the global, what we have developed in that area. And I think it's important to note too, we started doing that work and I think it was 2018. And right now it feels like it has legs. So I think here we are in a very initial phase, and that has to be okay. You know, I'm like, I want it all organized now. But as I'm listening, I'm like, one, how much do we really know about what is happening in each other's schools, or even in your own school? How much do others know within your own school of what's happening? So to Bob's note of really naming, maybe I don't know what your thoughts are on what are the first steps, because I'm even looking at you all and seeing all the different roles you're in. It's not like there's one person that is doing this in the school, and in each school it's a different person. So are we even in contact with the right people, or with enough people to respond to this? And then naming that, and then what information support do you need in the schools, and then what can we do collectively? I put in the chat 2027 is our next gathering, but we're not waiting for that. This is we are working towards what will happen there. So responses to all of that.
Catherine, your point is well taken, and I think we were on the same page. I'm going to hold this piece of paper up. Bob sent this out of all the different schools that we have, and I was wondering if we could actually even go deeper, right? So I know at St. Ignatius, they have a Reaching Magis program. It's a Saturday program for 5th through 8th graders. But I know our Reaching Magis director didn't really know that there are other programs that look like that out in the world. So how could we actually maybe get the context of every school, of, you know, what's happening in every school, and share that with others so we can see just what we are doing, and knowing, to your point, Megan, earlier, the definition of Reaching Magis in Cleveland may look very different than what it looks like in New York City, but there is some program that's working with boys or girls outside of your own school day. I feel like we have a space that there's all this good work happening, but we really don't even know yet that it's happening in such a, I'll just say for JSN North America way, but also globally too.
Yeah. There is a great amount of information that goes behind these slides. We collected a lot. One of the challenges of this work that I don't propose a solution to is that the definition of it is so wide, right? We had 40 something responses around just what do you do financially, right? And that was one subcategory of all of these different things. And so, you know, thinking about how do we narrow that enough not to cheapen it, but to kind of give a little bit of focus. Because if we try to talk about all of this at once, right, it is really slow going. And you could send out all the raw data for that we had from this survey, but you'd be looking at a spreadsheet, you know, 600 rows long, and that's hard for people to make good sense out of. And so I think thinking about, are there parts of this work that lend itself better to some of those early areas where we can really work together most productively and kind of narrow this and then grow from there?
Should we, so if we were to take a small bite here, and again, I think in categories. So tell me that I'm going in the wrong direction if I am. But would it be helpful for us to say, all right, these are the models that we have, and it's reflective of the sheet, Marianne, that you showed. Our models currently are tuition driven and non-tuition driven. So those are categories. And then down within those, in the tuition driven, we have the pre-secondary programs. Well, what are those pre-secondary programs? Nested middle schools, and then other pre-secondary like Reach or, those. And then we have secondary. Those would be the in-school already, Hurtado, Vinco, Loyola, and we start thinking about kind of categories and structures and such. And then we'd be able to bring those similar groups together, to begin having conversations that are in the same language. You know what I mean? It's almost like Pentecost. And I know I think sometimes too much in structures, but for me, that seems like it could be helpful. So then when we think to ourselves 2 years out in Scottsdale, Arizona, when we meet, we could have breakout sessions for these different groups. Similarly, Catherine, to the way you're doing it in the GPL now. And so the step ahead of us might be just to simply define what are the programs, what are the models, and then begin affinity grouping them. I don't know.
Yeah, there's also an element of what you all want to get out of this work, right? So sorting also by, we want to serve a lot more students, right, who fall under this umbrella, or we're comfortable at our current level of investment, we want to serve them better, right? That those two groups might have really different approaches to the work, right? And that might be a sorting mechanism too, to just say, where would you like to be 3-4 years out with respect to right to education students? And that might help sort by prioritization as well.
Can I add one thing too? Like, I don't want to lose this sense of belonging and ease in transitions. I think is so core, and I think like a third of you, maybe half, that are on this call are at work in DEIB. I'd be really curious, especially if you're not involved in the specific programming, but in this area, like what your thoughts and feedback as we're looking at all of this. Because part of what I'm trying to do is, how do we pull everyone together in problem solving what we do, or not problem solving, but strategic planning, how we move this forward. And in order to do that, I feel in a all school way, we do need different voices and different people in different roles that aren't specifically like connected directly, like Anthony, you're with that program, but what about the other people in your school? So I don't know if any of the if any of the people in DEI related work that are on the call that aren't involved directly with the programming of the this have thoughts that have emerged that you're willing to share, or suggestions more than thoughts.
I think I can put out a suggestion. So I'm at Marquette University High School. There aren't nested programs. That's not the model. But if you, the way I look at the DEIB work, it's work of influence, it's the work of relationship building. And so I leverage that as much as possible, and I get my hands in a lot of cookie jars, sometimes asked, sometimes invited, sometimes strong arm into it. But and I think there's a couple of benefits to that. One, obviously, is just the amount of information at schools, and then you take, the wide lens to the people on this call is so siloed, right? And in and of itself, the information sharing is a tangible, a very noble, tangible objective to produce out of this group. But in terms of at the school level, it's absolutely unbelievable how many different facets and programs there are at a school of 900, whatever that school population, 900 for us. And so I think that the first or an early suggestion to help is just how to centralize yourself in this role to so many different aspects and by getting that information, by getting that knowledge, by becoming a resource, you then become obviously more knowledgeable, but two, more influential in getting the greater work done.
Yeah. And that sense of having school-wide goals, right? It's not Adrian's goal, it's our goal collectively to like move this forward, right?
And I believe we scheduled this for an hour, so I don't want to go over. And however, I'm going to say if you don't want to be part of a committee or follow up, then you have to let me know before we hang up, and we're just about to hang up. So,
right. We punish the successful.
Roberto.
We punish the successful.
No, I want to say something that for me, from Latin America perspective or context, is so rich to see you, to find this research, the outcomes, because in some way, we also were thinking that the imaginary of traditional schools in Latin America, everybody feels like we just have this middle, high, and high population. And in reality, because we pay regularly, everybody pay the tuition. But it's not true. We have a more or less like the 15% of the population that have a different backgrounds. And sometimes we are just looking like if everybody was working with the same population. And I realized that when you says even the teachers need some kind of training and support to accompany these students and the families. Right now I'm visiting some schools in Europe, and the government, because they have this program subsidiary, and the government give them the students, no? So the first year they start looking what is the mixture of that, no? And in your way you have precise schools with different backgrounds and things, but also you have this opportunity in the schools to have more students for different backgrounds. And also I realized that the way that we made as a Ignatian spirituality way of proceeding is the one that this mixture helps, the spirituality helps this mixture of students and families and way of thinking and backgrounds to feel like in the same family. And that's, a very good news for me, because maybe this is true in all the world, but at least we are talking about these things. Little by little, we're going to talk more and more, because it's a reality in the global school network, no? But that's one of the things, because you are finishing the meeting, but maybe the next time I can join again.
Yeah,
Thank you very much
please. Thank you so much
me.
for joining. Thank you. And yeah, one of our parameters always, so many of these people are in classrooms. We kind of so fitting in. Thank you for making the time for the webinar today. We will stay in touch. I will be reaching out as we figure out our next steps. And Megan, I think if Megan needs the big bravo, because she is the data expert, and it really grounds our work. So with that, Bob, do you have any last, and also thank you, Danny. Those of you that were at how wonderful Danny is. Thank you also for being on today. and for accompanying us as we figure out our next steps.
You know, I just want to echo that. Thank you, Megan. It's
Yeah, of course.
great being in partnership with you. Just as I leave here, you know, when we developed the agenda for Detroit, we did do the 2 lungs. And I've been that's been confirmed, you know, at least that direction. And then digging down within those as a first step is probably something we're going to work on for 2 years out when we're together in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is what, March 7th through 9th, did we say, Catherine?
Yeah, I put it in the, yeah.
Right. And we'll be in touch.
Yeah.
March 2nd to 5th,
Yeah.
March 2 to 5, 2027. We'll but have that as our horizon goal to be
Yeah.
developing the next layer in our dig down of those 2 lungs. Makes a lot of sense to me. So I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you all. Good day.